2021. The announcement of Battlefield 2042 was everywhere. The trailers were spectacular. Massive battles, breathtaking graphics, and spectacular weather effects. It felt like a return to the series' best days. I was totally caught up in the hype, convinced that this game would be the Battlefield we had all been waiting for. So much so that I even pre-ordered it. But then came the launch. The first minutes of the game felt different. The excitement quickly gave way to disillusionment. Technical issues, half-baked features, and a general sense that Battlefield 2042 was simply not the game we had been promised. I had to admit to myself, I was blinded by the hype, and I wasn't alone. Many of us simply ignored the warning signs. The delayed development updates, vague statements, repeatedly postponed announcements. It was all there, right in front of us. But we didn't want to see it. Why? Because we wanted to believe that Battlefield 2042 would be the great return of the series that we had all been waiting for. How could it have come to this? How could a series that once stood for epic gripping battles fall so far? Was it just bad luck? A series of unfortunate coincidences? Or were these signs long before that Battlefield was on the wrong path? So let's take a look back at the history of Battlefield. From its early triumphs and groundbreaking ideas that changed the genre, through bold decisions and risky experiments, to the mistakes that cost the series its shine. And the big question remains, can Battlefield ever return to its former glory? The beginnings. Battlefield 1942. Let's go back to the year 2002. Back then, I was a little boy in Germany. Computers were nowhere near as widespread as they are today, and the internet was a luxury not everyone had. But there was one place where everything seemed possible: the internet cafes. We spent hours playing games like Counter-Strike, but then this new game came out, Battlefield 1942, and it captivated us all. We were actually way too young for such games, but back then no one really cared. As soon as school was over, we would meet up at the internet cafe and get started. Battlefield 1942 was unlike any other shooter we knew. There were huge maps where you could fight as infantry, roll in a tank, or fly a plane. All of that in one game. That was really something special back then. I still remember how we boarded a plane for the first time or tried to storm the enemy base with a tank. You never really knew what would happen next, and that's exactly what made it so exciting. It wasn't just about winning, it was about the fun of playing. We just played for the joy of it, celebrating every successful shot and laughing a lot when things went wrong again. Battlefield 1942 was just fun because it did so many things differently. It brought us a type of multiplayer experience we hadn't known back then, with teamwork, crazy actions, and a constant change between different roles on the battlefield. For many young gamers today, that might be hard to imagine. From today's perspective, Battlefield 1942 may not look so impressive anymore. The graphics are outdated, the gameplay might seem clunky, but back then it was revolutionary and completely captivated us. I spent a lot of money in those internet cafes and probably far too much time there, but Battlefield 1942 was worth it. It showed us what gaming had to offer and laid the foundation for everything that came after. The next step, Battlefield Vietnam. After the overwhelming success of Battlefield 1942, DICE wanted to take the next step. In 2004, Battlefield Vietnam was released, bringing the series to a completely new setting, the Vietnam War. For many of us, Battlefield Vietnam was a completely new experience. The maps were denser and more chaotic, full of jungles where you could easily hide or get lost. You had to think differently, play differently. The war in Vietnam brought a different feel and a different style of play. Suddenly, it wasn't just about man-to-man combat, but also about controlling dense jungles, rivers, and narrow paths. Helicopters became one of the most important elements in the game. And there was nothing like the feeling of piloting through smoke or jumping from a flying Huey as an infantryman. Battlefield Vietnam also introduced new weapons and vehicles typical of the scenario, like the M16, AK-47, M60, and the legendary Huey helicopter. The game managed to capture the unique character of the Vietnam War by emphasizing the differences between the US forces and the Viet Cong. But unlike in real asymmetric games, both sides ultimately had the same goal: to control the battlefield. Nevertheless, each side felt different. The USA relied on their air superiority and heavy equipment, while the Viet Cong depended on the natural environment and guerrilla tactics. And then there was the soundtrack. Battlefield Vietnam relied heavily on music to capture the game's mood. The playlist consisted of iconic songs from the 60s and 70s that perfectly suited the Vietnam War scenario. The game played a significant role in enhancing the atmosphere and putting the player right in the action. Every mission felt more intense and alive because of it. This musical accompaniment added so much to the game's atmosphere and made every match feel like a cinematic experience. Of course, Battlefield Vietnam also had its weaknesses. The dense vegetation sometimes made it difficult to spot enemies, and balancing between the factions was often an issue. But despite these problems, the game remained popular in the community and laid the groundwork for the series' future development. It was a title that experimented, introduced us to new mechanics, and offered a new way of playing. And even though it stood in the shadow of Battlefield 1942, it played a significant role in moving the series forward. The breakthrough: Battlefield 2. In 2005, DICE released the next major title in the series, Battlefield 2. This time it was about modern warfare, modern weapons, vehicles, and a graphics engine that made the game a new experience. Battlefield 2 retained the core idea of the series: large open maps where players fought against each other in teams, and brought it to a modern setting. With new vehicles, modern weapons, and fresh graphics, the game immediately felt different. One of the interesting new features was the Commander mode, which allowed one player to coordinate the team, deploy drones, or call in artillery support. It was a creative idea that added more strategic depth, but it wasn't loved by everyone. Some found it too complicated or simply enjoyed charging into battle more. This mode wasn't continued in later series entries. A real significant new feature was the squad system. Small groups of players could team up, act together, and support each other. This promoted teamwork and brought more structure and strategy to the game. Battlefield 2 struck a balance between action and strategy. It was no longer just a pure shooter. You also had to think about how to coordinate the team and how to optimally utilize the strengths and weaknesses of the different roles and vehicles. The game was very well received by the community. There was praise for the size of the maps, the variety of vehicles and weapons, and the ability to flexibly adapt your playstyle to the situation. And then there was the many expansions: Special Forces, Euroforce, and Armored Fury. Each expansion brought new maps, weapons, and vehicles into the game, keeping players occupied for years. These add-ons showed how ambitious DICE was to continuously expand and improve the gaming experience. For us players, Battlefield 2 brought many hours of fun and competition. Whether you tried your hand as a jet pilot or lay in a skyscraper as a sniper, the game offered something for every taste. Some of the maps from Battlefield 2 became so popular that they returned in later Battlefield titles. Maps like Gulf of Oman, Strike at Karkand, and Wake Island. They offered us not only different environments and challenges, but also became classics with cult status among players. Battlefield 2 was an important milestone because it showed how the series could evolve without losing its core. It was a time when Battlefield tried to bring more depth and variety to the game, and that made it one of the most popular games of its time. A look to the future: Battlefield 2142. In 2006, Battlefield took a bold leap into the future with Battlefield 2142. DICE went for a futuristic setting far removed from the previous World War or modern war scenarios. This time, it was about a future war on a planet threatened by a new ice age. In a world where resources were scarce and humanity fought over the last habitable areas, players were part of two major fractions: the European Union and the Pan-Asian Coalition. They fought in futuristic battles with new technology, advanced weapons, and even giant mechs. One of the most notable new features was the Titan mode. Two teams fought to defend or destroy massive flying warships called Titans. The goal was to storm the enemy Titans, break through their defenses, and eventually destroy the core. This mode brought a whole new strategic element to the game and challenged teams to fight both in the air and on the ground. Titan mode was a fresh and exciting addition to the series. It ensured that battles had an extra dimension and that players had to rethink their tactics in every round. The goal was not just to control the battlefield, but also to infiltrate and destroy the enemy Titan. But Battlefield 2142 also had some surprises, and not all positive ones. The game was one of the first to integrate so-called in-game advertising. Suddenly, there were digital billboards for real-world products and brands on the futuristic battlefields. For many players, this was unfamiliar and disruptive. This in-game advertising was not only a stylistic break in the immersive world of Battlefield 2142, but it also led to discussions about where the gaming industry was headed. Some players felt distracted by it or saw it as an attempt to push more ads on them while playing. For many of us, it was a strange feeling, fighting in a futuristic battle while simultaneously seeing real-world ad posters, a novelty that didn't appeal to everyone and sparked some debates within the community. Despite these controversies, Battlefield 2142 found its own fan base and remains to this day a unique title within the series, showing that Battlefield was ready to try new things, even if not all experiments were successful. Although Battlefield 2142 was not the greatest commercial success in the series, it remains a bold step and a reminder that the Battlefield series never shied away from trying new ideas. A new approach. Battlefield Bad Company. In 2008, Battlefield took a new direction with Battlefield Bad Company. This time, the focus was not only on multiplayer, but also on a humorous single-player campaign that showed us a whole new side of the series. Bad Company was different. Instead of just focusing on multiplayer, DICE offered a single-player campaign with its own story. The story followed a group of rogue soldiers on their chaotic missions, full of witty dialogues and unexpected twists. But the real star of the game was the Frostbite engine. For the first time, players could completely destroy the game world, blow up walls, bring down buildings, and pulverize cover. Suddenly, there were no safe places, and every match felt unpredictable. The destructive environment basically changed the gameplay. This destruction brought a new level of strategy to the game because you could no longer rely on static cover. Everything could change, and it did. Players could use the environment to their advantage, blow a hole in a wall to gain a new shooting angle, or destroy an entire side of a building to force an opposing team out of cover. It made every battle more dynamic and unpredictable. The possibilities seemed endless, and that made the multiplayer mode more exciting than ever. And then there was the humor. The members of Bad Company who kept getting themselves into trouble and exchanged sarcastic and witty dialogues brought a lightness to the game that set it apart from other shooters. It was a military story that didn't take itself too seriously. The multiplayer mode, of course, was back, with new maps, vehicles, and game modes. Bad Company brought fresh air into the series in this area as well. The destructible environment allowed new strategies and a dynamic gameplay experience that felt different in every match. Bad Company was positively received by both critics and players. It showed that Battlefield could be more than just a multiplayer shooter. It could also tell an entertaining and humorous story without losing its excitement and action. With Battlefield Bad Company, DICE bet on innovative destruction mechanics and fresh humor. A bold step that brought new fans to the series and proved that Battlefield was always ready to try new paths. But this experiment was not over yet. 2 years later, Bad Company was set to return in a sequel that would be bigger and better. The Experiments: Battlefield 1943 and Battlefield Heroes. In 2009, DICE decided on two unusual experiments: Battlefield 1943 and Battlefield Heroes. These two titles were not major milestones in the series, so we will only briefly address them. Battlefield 1943 was a digital download title that brought the classic maps from Battlefield 1942, like Wake Island and Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, back to life. But only for console players. It was a compact and accessible title, ideal for a quick battle in between. But this decision did not go down well with many fans, especially the loyal PC players. Battlefield had its roots on PC, and the fact that Battlefield 1943 was exclusively released on consoles felt like a betrayal to many. Many wondered why the game wasn't made available on all platforms. And then there was Battlefield Heroes, a free-to-play game that went in a completely different direction. With its cartoonish aesthetics, simplified gameplay, and focus on microtransactions, it offered a distinctively different experience from the traditional Battlefield titles. The reactions to Battlefield Heroes were mixed. While the game attracted new, younger players, many old Battlefield fans were repelled. Many players criticized the simplified style and the departure from what Battlefield was all about: large battles, strategic gameplay, and teamwork. The introduction of microtransactions, which made the game free to play, but solid cosmetic and gameplay advantages, also faced resistance. For many longtime fans, it felt like DICE was diluting the original concept of the series to reach a broader audience. Both titles, Battlefield 1943 and Battlefield Heroes, were attempts to take new paths. But while they won some new players, many longtime fans of the series felt excluded or disappointed. It was an experiment that was bold but did not inspire enthusiasm everywhere. The Return: Battlefield: Bad Company 2. In 2010, Battlefield returned with Bad Company 2. And this time, it was about improving on what the first installment had introduced. Battlefield: Bad Company 2 took everything that made its predecessor great and built on it to raise the bar for the series even higher. The Frostbite engine was back, and this time, the destruction was even more extensive. Entire buildings could be leveled in seconds. Walls were no longer safe. Cover could disappear at any moment, and the battlefield was constantly in motion. The destructive environment provided an even more dynamic and unpredictable gameplay experience. Every match felt different, and players had to constantly adapt to the changing conditions. It was this unpredictability that made Bad Company 2 so gripping. The multiplayer mode of Bad Company 2 was more extensive and better than ever, with new maps, vehicles, and game modes. The game offered a variety of possibilities that excited fans of the series, especially the Rush mode, where one team tries to defend or destroy MCOM stations, quickly became a favorite. The single-player campaign also returned with the familiar characters from Bad Company, full of humor, charm, and explosive action. This time, it was about trying to find and destroy a mysterious Russian weapon that could plunge the world into chaos. Bad Company 2 was praised by both critics and players. Many even claim it is the best Battlefield of all time because it masterfully balanced an exciting single-player experience and a deep multiplayer mode. Yet despite the success of Bad Company 2 and the loyal fanbase, DICE decided to steer the series in a different direction. It was the last time we heard from the quirky Bad Company crew, at least for now. But while Bad Company 2 secured its place as one of the best Battlefield titles, the series was preparing to return to its roots, and delivered an installment that is still considered an absolute classic today. The breakthrough into the mainstream: Battlefield 3. 2011 was supposed to be the year when Battlefield would finally cement its place in the mainstream with Battlefield 3. DICE released a game that would shatter all previous standards. Battlefield 3 set new standards for graphics and sound design. Thanks to the new Frostbite 2 engine, the game looked stunning. From detailed textures to realistic lighting effects, every explosion, every destructible environment was a visual highlight. But it wasn't just the graphics that impressed. The sound design was equally groundbreaking. The thunderous sound of artillery, the screech of jets, the echo of gunfire, all contributed to making you feel like you were in the middle of a realistic battlefield. The single-player campaign, however, left a mixed impression. While it offered some cinematic moments and exciting missions, many players found it too linear and uninspired. While it had its entertainment value, it has probably long been forgotten by most. But the true heart of Battlefield 3 was, of course, the multiplayer, with huge maps where up to 64 players could fight at the same time. The game offered one of the most extensive and dynamic multiplayer experiences ever seen in a shooter. Vehicles like tanks, jets, helicopters, and boats enabled diverse tactics and variety of playstyles. Maps like Caspian Border and Operation Metro quickly became community favorites. Each map offered different challenges, from open battles in wide landscapes to intense fights in narrow corridors and cities. Players had countless opportunities to develop and perfect their strategies. After the launch of Battlefield 3, DICE kept players engaged with a series of DLCs. Expansions like Back to Karkand, which brought back classic maps from earlier Battlefield games, Close Quarters for intense infantry battles, and Armored Kill with massive vehicle battles offered new content and ensured that the game remained relevant long after its release. Each DLC brought new maps, weapons, vehicles, and modes that continuously expanded and deepened the gaming experience. Battlefield 3 was celebrated by both critics and players alike. It was hailed as a masterpiece of the modern shooter, convincingly combining a perfect mix of realistic warfare and exciting gameplay. The game sold millions of copies in its first week and became a global phenomenon. For many players, it was their first encounter with the series, and Battlefield 3 managed to captivate not only old fans, but also an entirely new generation of players. It was a game that redefined the boundaries of what a multiplayer shooter could achieve. With Battlefield 3, DICE succeeded in making the series a true mainstream hit. It combined stunning graphics, intense battles, and a deep multiplayer experience that forever changed the franchise. After this huge success, it was clear Battlefield was here to stay, and the world was eagerly awaiting the next step in the series. Bigger, better, but not flawless. Battlefield 4. After the success of Battlefield 3, DICE wanted to take the series to the next level. In 2013, Battlefield 4 was released, a game that was supposed to be bigger, more spectacular, and even more ambitious. With Battlefield 4, DICE once again relied on the Frostbite engine, this time in version 3. The graphics were stunning, from realistic weather effects to the most detailed explosions ever seen in a shooter. The lighting, the animations, the particle effects, everything was further enhanced to create an immersive experience. One of the biggest new features was the so-called Levolution. Players could influence the entire environment on a large scale, like bringing down a skyscraper or blowing up a dam, completely changing the dynamics of the battlefield. These monumental destructions made every match unpredictable and kept the tension high. The single-player campaign of Battlefield 4 tried to correct the mistakes of Battlefield 3, but largely failed. Despite some intense moments and impressive graphics, the plot felt cliché and uninspired. The characters remained flat, and the story never really captivated. Many players viewed the campaign as a mere addition to what the game was truly about, the multiplayer. As with its predecessors, the real focus on Battlefield 4 was on multiplayer. With 64 players, new maps, and modes, the game offered one of the most comprehensive multiplayer experiences in the shooter genre. The dynamic destruction and the vast battlefields created unforgettable moments. But the launch of Battlefield 4 was catastrophic. The game was plagued with severe technical problems. Server crashes, connection errors, and numerous bugs caused massive frustration in the community. In the first few months after its release, Battlefield 4 felt unfinished for many players, a condition exacerbated by the aggressive marketing campaign and the massive hype beforehand. DICE had to work intensively to regain the trust of the players. Over many months, the studio released numerous patches and updates to improve performance and fix bugs. Despite the initial hurdles, Battlefield 4 managed to keep players engaged with a series of DLCs. These expansions brought new maps, vehicles, weapons, and game modes, helping keep the game fresh and exciting. The community remained active and engaged, and over time, Battlefield 4 developed into one of the most beloved titles in the series. Many have since forgotten how problematic the game was at launch. Battlefield 4 remains actively played to this day, and many fans consider it one of the best parts of the series despite its initial problems. The large-scale warfare, attention to detail, and intense multiplayer experience have been etched into players' memories. But while DICE continued to perfect the formula, the series soon faced new challenges and further experiments. A bold but controversial turn. Battlefield Hardline. In 2015, DICE surprised fans with an unexpected twist. Instead of the usual large-scale military battles, Battlefield Hardline took us in a completely new direction, a world of police and crime. Developed by Visceral Games, Battlefield Hardline departed from the familiar military scenario in favor of a focus on cops and robbers. The game offered new modes like Heist, where criminals attempt to pull off a robbery while the police try to stop them, and Hotwire, a sort of chase mode where cars and speed took center stage. Battlefield Hardline's single-player campaign attempted to tell a story in the style of a TV crime series, complete with cliffhangers and characters who weren't always on the right side of the law. It was a bold attempt to expand the genre and explore new narrative paths. But the fans' reactions were mixed and often even negative. Many players felt outright blindsided by the decision to abandon the proven military scenario. The Battlefield community was known for its love of large battles, vehicle combat, and the feeling of being part of a real war. Instead, they got a game that felt like a police drama, an approach that many fans simply didn't want. The multiplayer mode of Hardline was faster and more focused than traditional Battlefield games. The maps were smaller, the battles more intense, and the rounds shorter. While this appealed to some players, many missed the tactical team play and deeper strategic level that characterized the series. I personally didn't find Battlefield Hardline that bad. It had its weaknesses, sure, but it also brought fresh ideas to the series. The new orientation as a police versus gangster scenario certainly had its appeal, and the new dynamics and faster gameplay were a lot of fun for me. It felt like an interesting mix of classic Battlefield and something entirely new. However, Battlefield Hardline's launch was tepid. It was clear that the game did not evoke the same excitement as its predecessors. Many saw it as just an interim episode and were relieved when DICE announced a return to the series' roots. In the end, Hardline was a bold attempt that found resonance with some fans, but did not achieve what many had hoped for from a new Battlefield title. It remains an interesting but also controversial part of the series. After this mixed experiment, DICE decided to return to the roots and give the series back what players loved most: large-scale warfare and epic battles. A return to the roots. Battlefield 1. In 2016, DICE surprised the community with a bold decision. Instead of going further into the future, Battlefield 1 returned to the roots of warfare, taking players back to World War I. Battlefield 1 brought the series back to a time rarely covered in video games before. With its impressive graphics and unparalleled sound design, the game set new standards in war depiction. The Frostbite engine once again demonstrated its capabilities. the devastating destruction on the battlefields, the horrors, and the chaos of war were captured with an intensity and authenticity rarely seen. The single-player campaign of Battlefield 1 was presented as an anthology, telling different stories from various perspectives of the war. It highlighted the lives of soldiers from different countries and conflicts from the trenches in France to the deserts of Arabia. The campaign received much praise for its emotional depth and impressive storytelling. But once again, the star of the game was the multiplayer. Battlefield 1 expanded the large-scale warfare with gigantic battles that put players in the roles of infantry, tank drivers, pilots, and even cavalrymen. The maps were vast and varied, with dynamic weather effects that could change each round. Especially the new Operations mode quickly became the highlight of the game. Here, players fought across multiple maps in large-scale offensives that recreated real battles of World War I. The mode offered a unique sense of immersion and tactical depth, highly appreciated by players. The marketing campaign of Battlefield 1 was as impressive as the game itself. The epic trailer featuring the song Seven Nation Army gave goosebumps and quickly became one of the most liked gaming trailers on YouTube. It perfectly captured the game's atmosphere and fueled the hype of Battlefield's comeback. But despite the historical setting, Battlefield 1 had little in common with the reality of World War I. The number of automatic weapons and gadgets used in the game drove some historians nearly crazy. Machine pistols and shotguns were more common than rifles, and the soldiers moved with a speed and agility far from the slow and grueling trench warfare of the real World War I. Despite these artistic liberties, Battlefield 1 was celebrated by both critics and players. It was seen as a fresh breeze for the series, a game that dared to present traditional warfare in a new way. Sales figures were impressive, and Battlefield 1 quickly became one of the most successful titles in the series. The decision to choose World War I as the setting paid off. Battlefield 1 brought the series back to its roots and reminded players why they loved these battles so much. The epic scale, the strategic depth, and the sheer intensity of combat. With Battlefield 1, DICE found its way back into the hearts of the fans. It combined a refreshing historical perspective with the intense action that characterized the series. But while Battlefield 1 put the series back on track, the next big challenge was already on the horizon. A return to World War II, but with a whole new approach. A controversial return. Battlefield 5. In 2018, DICE once again tried to return to the roots, this time with Battlefield 5, a game that was supposed to depict World War II in a way that had never been seen before. It was intended to be a homage to the series' classic while utilizing the latest technology. With Battlefield 5, DICE wanted to offer players a comprehensive experience of World War II. The Frostbite engine once again showcased its strengths with stunning graphics, destructible environments, and dynamic weather effects. This time, ray tracing was also introduced, making reflections and lighting effects even more realistic and elevating the graphics to a new level. Players experienced battles on various fronts, from the beaches of North Africa to the snowy hills of Norway. The multiplayer was, as usual, the heart of the game. The dynamic destruction and vast maps offered an unparalleled battlefield experience. Buildings could be completely destroyed, cover swept away, and entire landscapes reduced to rubble. The new ray tracing technology ensured that these destructions and light reflections appeared impressively real. But even before the release, Battlefield 5 came under fire. The first trailer, which featured a female soldier with a prosthetic arm and scenes that did not conform to traditional World War II depictions, sparked heated debate. Many fans felt disappointed by the historical accuracy. The inclusion of women in the game was also controversial. Some welcomed the inclusion, while others found the portrayal inaccurate and unrealistic for the historical period. The discussion about historical accuracy went far beyond the question of inclusion. Historians and hardcore fans noted that Battlefield 5 took many artistic liberties that did not correspond to the actual war events. The number of women in frontline combat, the clothing and equipment of the soldiers, the abundance of automatic weapons and gadgets, all of this drove some hardcore fans nearly mad. Despite these controversies, the technical side of the game was convincing. Battlefield 5's graphics were breathtaking. The details of the environment, the destructible buildings, and the destruction effects were unmatched. Ray tracing brought a new dimension to realism with reflective surfaces, dynamic lighting, and an immersive atmosphere that brought the battlefields to life. A particular highlight of Battlefield 5's single-player campaign was the Last Tiger mission. Here, players took on the role of a German tank commander, steering his Tiger tank through the final days of the war. This perspective was an unusual and bold step by DICE. It is rare for players in a World War II shooter to experience the story from the perspective of a German soldier. The Last Tiger mission offered a deeper and more reflective narrative than one would expect from a typical shooter. The story focused not only on combat but also on the inner turmoil of the crew, soldiers forced to face the harsh realities of war and their moral questions. The tank commander, Peter Mueller, and his crew increasingly questioned the purpose of their fight, their loyalty to Nazi ideology, and the horrors they had caused. However, it was not just the controversies about historical accuracy and portrayal that troubled the game. Battlefield 5 had a different launch. Technical problems, bugs, and balance issues led to frustration within the community. In addition, missing content and a chaotic communication strategy from DICE left many fans uncertain. Another major failure was the Battle Royale mode, Firestorm, announced with great hype. It was supposed to compete with the giants of the genre. But Firestorm launched late, felt unfinished, and failed to meet expectations. The community quickly lost interest, and DICE eventually abandoned the mode altogether. Today, Firestorm is little more than a footnote in the series' history. As with Battlefield 4, DICE had to work hard to regain the players' trust. Numerous updates, new maps, weapons, and game modes were released to keep the player base engaged, but interest remained muted. Although Battlefield 5 eventually became a solid gaming experience, and many fans appreciated the improvements, the title always remained somewhat controversial. For many, it was a return to the roots that did not evoke the same fascination as earlier titles. Despite all the controversies and challenges, Battlefield 5 remains an active title with a loyal player base to this day. The varied battles, the destructible environment, and the impressive graphics continued to appeal to many fans. But while the discussions around Battlefield 5 continued, DICE was preparing for the next big step. A new chapter that would take the series in a completely new direction. A difficult leap into the future. Battlefield 2042. In 2021, DICE attempted a bold leap into the future with Battlefield 2042. The game was supposed to take the series into a new modern war era and offer an entirely new gaming experience, one that would captivate both veterans and new players. Battlefield 2042 introduced a number of new features. For the first time in a long time, there was no traditional single-player campaign. However, the lack of a campaign was not a big loss for most players. Battlefield had always been known for its multiplayer battles, but the choice of setting and the new specialists met with massive criticism. Battlefield 2042 was supposed to be set in a dark future, a world thrown into chaos by environmental disasters and geopolitical conflicts. But the specialists, characters with cliched, often cringeworthy lines, seemed out of place and broke any immersion. Players missed the traditional classes that had once defined Battlefield. The decision to replace these with the new specialists was considered questionable by many. The clear role distribution and strategic team play were lost. Another major promise of Battlefield 2042 was the extreme weather events, tornadoes, sandstorms, and other natural disasters that were supposed to change gameplay in real time. But in practice, these turned out to be more of a marketing gimmick than a relevant part of the game. The impact of natural disasters was often minimal and quickly became a side effect that rarely delivered the dynamic gameplay experience that was hoped for. The maps themselves were also a big problem, with few maps at launch, which were also empty and unimaginatively designed. There was a lack of variety and tactical possibilities. Many areas of the maps felt simply dead, without the characteristic points that created exciting battles. It took months for DICE to start reworking the maps to make them denser and more engaging. And then there was the absence of a simple scoreboard, a basic element of almost every multiplayer shooter. This decision was simply incomprehensible to many players and led to widespread ridicule in the community. Why had DICE removed such a basic feature? Battlefield 2042 also introduced a new mode called Hazard Zone, which attempted to be a mix of Battle Royale and extraction game modes. But like the failed Firestorm, Hazard Zone was doomed from the start. Player numbers remained low and DICE quietly abandoned the mode soon after, another failed experiment. The only bright spot was the Portal mode, which allowed players to combine maps and weapons from earlier Battlefield games and set their own rules. This brought a wave of nostalgia and offered a creative freedom that many appreciated, but even this mode couldn't save the main game. But the list of problems didn't stop there. Battlefield 2042 had a slightly problematic launch. Technical issues, bugs, connection drops, and performance problems plagued the game from the start. In addition, there were balance issues and the absence of features that had been standard in previous titles. DICE made efforts to improve the game with numerous updates and patches, but the player base shrank rapidly, and many felt that the improvements were too little too late. The disappointment was great, and Battlefield 2042 quickly became one of the most controversial titles in the series. With sharply reduced player numbers, it became clear what was meant to be a big step into the future ended up being one of the biggest disappointments in the series' history. Many fans saw Battlefield 2042 as a game that had lost the essence of what makes Battlefield the epic battles, the teamwork, and the tactical depth. Although DICE continued to release updates and improvements, skepticism remained high. Many players turned away, wondering if Battlefield could ever return to its roots. The journey of Battlefield has been anything but easy, full of ups and downs, triumphs and setbacks. But one thing is certain, the story is not over yet. A look to the future. Ambition or skepticism? After the difficult start of Battlefield 2042, the future of the series remains uncertain. But DICE and EA have already announced that the next Battlefield will be one of the most ambitious projects in our history. Ambitious? A word that evokes both hope and skepticism. Many players are wondering what DICE will do differently this time, and whether the promise to bring the series back to its former strength will really be kept this time. Too often in the past there has been big announcements that were not fulfilled. The player base remains skeptical. The past few years have shown that big words do not always lead to great games. Will the next Battlefield really correct the mistakes of the past and bring the series back on the right track? Or will we see another chapter full of missed opportunities? But while Battlefield struggles with its reputation, a new competitor has emerged: Delta Force. The upcoming title shows how seriously another developer is trying to enter Battlefield's territory. The initial reactions from the community are impressively positive. Many players are excited about what they have seen so far. Could Delta Force become the new alternative for all those disappointed by the recent Battlefield titles? A new chapter in the shooter genre seems to be being written, and the competition is not asleep. Whether Battlefield will return and maintain its leading role remains to be seen. One thing is certain: the coming years will be decisive for the future of the series. Whether ambitious plans or empty promises, fans will continue to follow the series critically. That was our look at the history of Battlefield. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe for more content. Feel free to tell us in the comments what your best Battlefield moments were and what you wish for the future of the series. We'll see you in the next video.